You're listening to the Mommy Labor Nurse podcast, where you'll gain the tools, knowledge, and confidence you need to erase the unknowns, feel in control, and have an even better birth no matter how you deliver. My name is Liesel Teen, mom of two, practicing labor and delivery nurse, and your host. From over 8 years and counting of working at the bedside, I know that knowledge is the key to an even better birth. So tune in each week to learn about all things pregnancy, birth, and postpartum from me, a labor and delivery nurse that's seen it all. And now let's get into this week's episode.
Welcome back to week 8. I'm a little under the weather this week because I have COVID, and I know it's already Wednesday. Apologies for getting this episode out late. I know it's been a little inconsistent with the podcast schedule lately. I used to always publish them on Monday, and I had other people who were helping me, and things have just been a little different behind the scenes. That's all I'll say about that. So that is why it's been a little bit inconsistent here in terms of the episodes and the schedule, and I don't know, I just feel like the direction, right? I love this podcast. I love it so much, but it has been hard to manage just with some of the other things that have been going on in the background of Mommy Labor Nurse and in Liesel's life. So I know I've kind of been alluding to this over the past few weeks, and I'm not sure that I'm quite ready to talk about things a little bit more in detail, but just bear with me, guys. I honestly feel like I have gone through a purge, like a toxicity purge in so many areas of my life, and I've just had to kind of keep everything stable, through it. And now I feel like I'm finally climbing out of it, and it feels so good. And I know I want to just talk about it and just really, really explain where I'm coming from, but I can't quite yet. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to completely, but Liesel's been through some changes lately. That's all I'll say. But I can assure you that Liesel's not going anywhere. Liesel's not going anywhere. Okay. And if anything, Liesel is more Liesel than Liesel has ever been in her whole entire life. And it feels so fucking good. Finally, Jesus Christ. Okay. Sorry. I'm telling you, things are shifting, and it's good. And it feels good to just start living in it. So yeah, if there's an episode that's called Liesel's ridiculous, crazy ass story, you better listen to it, because I got some tea. So yeah, but like I said, I don't even know if I'm going to go there. I'm just telling y'all, I'm just trying to be upfront and honest that my life has been a little crazy lately, but for good. And I'm finally realizing that it's for so good. And yeah, it feels good. Anyways, this week's episode, what's it about? It is about how to give birth without an epidural. I did an episode. Let's see, what was the date on here? Let me just check. This was September 12th, 2022. Let's see, what was going on in my life? September 12th, 2022. Let's see. So Rylan had just turned 1. We were already in this house, and my sister was about to get married. She got married in November of 2022. And I was going through some really stressful things in my marriage. And like I said, I'm not going to go into that, but I was going through some really stressful things during that point, and it was about to catapult. So yeah, that's what was going on in my life in September 2022. But that's when this episode originally came out. But that's not the point. We're not going to be talking about Liesel. We're talking about how to give birth without an epidural. And this episode I picked because it just answers that question so well. I hate reading things or getting advice from people that, it's not like concrete tips. And I feel like I tell my story, I talk about my experience, right? But I'm also like, here's what you need to know and here's what you don't need to know. And it is what it is. There's no secret formula, right? Everybody's going to do little things a little bit differently. But I like this episode because I feel like I go into what I feel like you need to know best if that is your goal, to give birth without an epidural. So I know this was a long intro, but I love y'all. Thanks for sticking with me through these. How many years have I been? I've been doing this since 2019 on the podcast. I've been out on the internet being mommy labor nurse since 2018, but I've been podcasting since 2019. So thank you for sticking with me. I love y'all. And yeah, let's get into this week's episode.
Today, we are going to talk all about birthing without an epidural and answer the question, how do you have a natural birth? And we're going to get into the word natural too. Don't worry, I understand the heaviness behind the word natural, okay? I promise I'm going to talk about it. So, did you know that an estimated 71% of births in the U.S. use epidurals? And some hospitals cite stats of over 90% of births involving epidural use. And there is nothing wrong with epidurals. They're cool. But if you want to try and birth without one, it is my hope that by the end of listening to this podcast episode, I can help you learn about the benefits of birthing without an epidural and what you can actually do to achieve that desire. Okay. So I told you I was going to talk about the word natural. So what is a quote unquote natural birth? So natural birth, I mean, this isn't, from dictionary.com, but in general, natural birth is a term that is widely accepted to mean giving birth without an epidural. Some people interchange the word natural and unmedicated. Some people even interchange the word natural and vaginal as opposed to having a C-section. So they'll say, I had a natural birth, and they just mean I had a vaginal birth, regardless of if, I got an epidural or I did this, that, and the other. And the problem with that is someone who's had a C-section may feel like that their C-section wasn't even birth. I also know that some epidural mamas take issues with the term natural, meaning without an epidural, because of the argument that all birth is natural. And I hear that and I acknowledge that. But I also know that by and large, our society accepts natural to mean without an epidural. Labeling your birth is something that only you get to do, right? And I challenge you not to let labels like the word natural that other people use define your experience and your beliefs. I do believe that the term natural birth is becoming outdated, and I much prefer the term birthing without an epidural to describe this sort of birth experience that I'm going to be talking about today. And here at Mommy Labor Nurse, we firmly believe that all types of birth are beautiful, right? And that there is no one right way to give birth. At the end of the day, you and your baby's safety are always most important, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach to birth. Mommy Labor Nurse empowers mamas just like you to have the tools that they need to attempt the birth that they desire, but we're thoughtful in our approach and education so that no mama is set up for disappointment or feels like a failure if something unexpected occurs, because we don't want that to happen. I know what it feels like to be a failure, and it just doesn't feel good. So that is really honestly one of my number one goals behind my birth courses and just my whole platform is I want to eliminate that whole feeling of coming away from your birth and feeling like there was something wrong with you, or you felt like, oh, I had a C-section and I'm a failure because of it, or, oh, I was planning on going, without an epidural and I got an epidural and I was a failure because of it. No, ma'am. No. Okay. So with all of that being said, let's move on now to learn more about birthing without epidurals. Okay. We're going to talk about benefits first. Okay. So if birthing without an epidural is something that you're interested in, I always think, first learning about the benefits is kind of a really good place to start. Getting mentally pumped up and choosing a why behind your motivation to birth without the use of an epidural can be very powerful for your mental preparation, right? So I have 10 benefits here. Number 1, your labor might be shorter, especially the second stage or the pushing phase. Epidural use can lengthen the time spent pushing. It is evidence-based. There have been studies that have said, hey, if you have an epidural, you are more likely to push a little bit longer. And that makes sense because the bedsides, we see moms who have epidurals and it takes them a little bit sometimes to kind of get used to pushing, because when you have an epidural, sometimes it's really, really hard to push because you're numb down there and it doesn't feel instinctual. Even though you might be feeling pressure, it's just hard. And I haven't had an epidural personally, so I can't speak from personal experience, but this is just what I've seen at the bedside, that sometimes it just kind of takes a few pushes, a little bit of time to really get the hang of it. Next benefit, you may avoid a stalled labor. So some research also suggests that epidurals slow the progress of your labor, leading to the use of Pitocin to try to move it along. And in some cases, a stalled labor can even make having a C-section necessary. Number 3, you might avoid the cascade of interventions. Bum, bum, bum. And I talk about this cascade of interventions, which is not studied and it's not evidence-based, but it's something, again, that we see at the bedside. I talk about this in my birth courses a whole lot. So this cascade of interventions can possibly lead to C-sections or getting an epidural. And this is because medical interventions can sometimes interfere with your body's natural response to labor and birth. Basically, the cascade of interventions is like, the first intervention is you getting induced. And all of these things I'm about to talk about are not like quote unquote bad. I'm not saying don't get induced or don't, do this, that, and the other. I'm just trying to explain exactly what the cascade of interventions, this phenomenon that people talk about is. So let's say the first intervention, medical intervention, is that you are getting induced with Pitocin. And if you're getting induced with Pitocin, you might have stronger contractions, more erratic contractions, and that might cause you to want an epidural sooner than maybe you would have wanted one if you hadn't been induced. So let's say you get an epidural and we give you a lot of fluid, because when we give you an epidural, we have to dose you up with a bunch of fluid. And sometimes a bunch of fluid can space out your contractions. We're looking at, the monitor and we're saying, oh, your contractions are kind of spaced out. Provider says, oh, you know what? Let's do another intervention. Let's break your water. So now Pitocin, okay, we've gotten an epidural and breaking the water. And now because we've broken the water, maybe your baby's, coming down and they're having these heart rate changes. And we're like, oh, you're having heart rate changes. We got to do some more interventions, flip to one side, give you an amnion infusion to, help baby out. And then maybe we give you that amnion infusion, which is basically this catheter that we put inside your cervix to give you more fluid. So it's another thing inside. So maybe that increases your risk of an infection. Then you start to get a fever and we give you medication to help your fever, but then you need to C-section. You can just see how one thing can possibly lead to another, which can possibly lead to another, which can possibly lead to another. And again, none of these things that I'm saying are quote unquote bad. Okay. I'm just trying to give sort of an example of how one thing sometimes can lead to another. There are plenty of moms that I take care of that they get induced and they happily give birth without epidurals. And there's no cascade of interventions. But sometimes when we talk about this, it kind of makes sense to draw out a possible cascade, if that makes sense. So back to benefits. Next benefit, your recovery time will probably be faster after having a birth without an epidural, especially versus a C-section, which involves recovery from abdominal surgery. But the fact that you don't have to wait for your legs to denumb is a really huge perk. You can just get up and move around almost immediately after you give birth, as long as your vital signs are stable. And just in general, most people just feel a little bit better. You don't have to wait for your legs to wake up. It's just your recovery time's just a little bit quicker. Next benefit, you may experience less postpartum swelling. And most mamas who give birth without an epidural report a little bit less postpartum swelling because with epidurals, again, I talked about this a little bit, but we have to give you fluids before you get your epidural. And sometimes even we have to give you fluids afterwards if your blood pressure is kind of out of whack. So there's just a lot of extra fluid, so you can have this extra swelling. So That's definitely a benefit. You probably won't be as swollen as you would be if you got an epidural. Another benefit, it does lower your risk of vaginal tears. So epidural use is associated with an increased risk of severe perineal tears, although the overall risk for severe perineal tears is very low in general, about I think 3 to 4%, but it's slightly lower for moms who give birth without epidurals. Another benefit, it lowers your risk for fever and low blood pressure during labor. A 2018 Cochrane review found that people with epidurals were more likely to experience low blood pressure and fever during labor. Another one is that avoiding an epidural may possibly lower your risk of an unplanned C-section. Now, we've talked about this on the podcast a little bit. I've talked about this on my platform, but in some cases, slow or stalled labors, which can occur with epidural use, could result in unplanned C-sections because other more significant complications arise wherein it's important to get baby out. Stat. We want that baby out. The research is mixed on whether epidural use results in higher instances of C-sections. Okay, it's a big debate, but it's just something to be aware of that this might be a benefit. And then the final benefit is, again, this is very anecdotal, but you might get an intense high, okay? And what I mean by that is, let me paint the picture for you. So if you have an epidural, you are still going to have a baby and just be in awe of this little baby that you just pushed out of you and be like on top of the world. But what I've seen with moms who don't have epidurals, it's like they go from extreme pain, pushing their baby out, no anesthesia. And then their baby's here and it's like extreme joy. And it's that huge shift sometimes that makes your dopamine levels are like, and it's this big drastic change that gives you just this crazy intense adrenaline rush. And again, you can definitely still have this if you get an epidural. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just speaking from experience and kind of seeing one group versus the other, that you're more likely to get that huge rush. So let's move on. So let's talk about how to have a natural / birthing without an epidural birth. So now that you've learned some of the benefits, I thought I would go through some of the steps that I see are most effective towards having a natural birth. Number 1, what do you think I'm going to say? Prepare. So many second-time moms who connect with me say that they wanted to birth without an epidural the first time, but they didn't prepare and they wound up with an epidural. Again, that's not bad. Okay. Epidurals are great and wonderful things, but if you are planning to birth without one and then you get one, you're still not meeting your wishes. Okay. So then the second time around, they take the time to get educated and prepared and they have their natural birth. For many, simply wanting a natural birth isn't quite enough, and having the right education and preparation in place really is key. And going along with preparing, it's also important to get the right support. That's a critical factor. So find out what the intervention rates and epidural use rates are in your hospital. A lot of people don't realize that that's actually really important. You can ask your provider their stance on epidurals. Consider switching to a provider that will support your wish to try and birth without an epidural if you don't get a good vibe from your provider. Because here's the thing. If you are the kind of person that's like, hey, I'm really interested in birthing without an epidural, but you are at a practice where they have crazy high epidural rates and C-section rates, you might not be at the right place to get that right support. So it's always worth kind of just investigating and looking at the clear picture yourself to make sure you're at the right practice and at the right hospital too. If you are low risk, consider using a certified nurse midwife if you have one in your area who delivers at your hospital. Some studies do show that simply planning for a natural birth with a midwife reduces your risk of C-section. And the stat that I have here is from 30% to 5%. But of course, that data should be taken with a grain of salt because only low-risk moms can deliver with a midwife to begin with. But still, it's definitely worth looking into if midwifery care could be a good fit for you. All right, the sound of that heartbeat means it's time for this week's segment of Birth It Up babies. This one says, "Hi, Liesel. Huge thank you for your Birth It Up epidural series and your platform in general for helping me prepare for my daughter's arrival. While her birth ended up very different from what I was expecting with an emergency C-section 3 weeks early." Oh, yeah, that's quite different than most people going into their birth, any birth, first, second, third, whatever. You don't expect to have an emergency C-section 3 weeks early. She says, "I can say with confidence that I was very prepared by taking your class and following you here." And this was an Instagram DM. That's where I get most of the Birth It Up babies. And side note, if you want to send me a Birth It Up baby, I love them. And that's the best way to send them to me is just via DM. You can also email us, but we check our DMs. So you can just send them through DMs. She said, "Understanding that sometimes things happen unexpectedly was invaluable, and both my husband and I were able to navigate the changes to our delivery experience with as much grace as possible." That really, that kind of stuff gives me chills, and that makes me just so, that makes me so happy that I'm able to take an experience that would have been traumatic and make it a little bit less traumatic, because I can't tell you how many people would have had this same experience and looked at this as so, so traumatic. So that just makes me so happy. She ended by saying, "The most important thing was staying relaxed and knowing that in the end, no matter what, all that mattered was the safety of me and my daughter. Thank you for the education and virtual support along the way." Oh, it warms my heart. I love these messages. And if you want to have an even better birth, just like this mama, head on over to mommylabornurse.com/courses to get lifetime access to all 3 of my online birth classes. So much of giving birth without an epidural really, really is a mind game. And I talk about this a lot in my birth courses. Stay committed to your wishes and learn the right skills to cope with the pain of childbirth mentally. Your number one tool for handling the pain during your natural birth is going to be your brain. Mental willpower, mentally trusting your body's innate ability to birth, and mentally coping with the pain. So, with all that said, let's go over some mental tips for coping with the pain. These are directly from my birth courses, and I'm going to go over a few, but I have tons more within my courses. So, number 1, what I tell people to do is remind yourself that you can do anything for 10 seconds, okay? Which is how long the peak of your contraction will likely be. Whenever I share this tip, I always think of The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. Have you guys seen that show? It's on Netflix. It's with the girl, Ellie. I forget what her last name is, but she's from The Office. And remember at the end of the first season, she had her arm in the crank or something, and I forget if she was, see, now I'm going to sound like I don't know anything, but I just remember she had her arm in this crank sort of machine, and she kept telling herself, "You can do anything for 10 seconds. And she would do it for 10 seconds. And then she would say it again, "You can do anything for 10